Okay, let's Google some art. Georges Michel. Whew. Let's treat this guy lightly. Man, I just don't know. French history is dark. I believe Michel was reflecting his times probably more sincerely and accurately than others. He was also derided. His stuff is bleak. This is just a study done on location. So we could look at the technique, similar to what the Barbizon school would do later, and it's well painted. But the elements, what we're looking at here, don't change much from any of his other paintings. This stuff is gloomy. I've been having a hard time finding good enlargements of these images. I've been saving some images as I've gone along this morning. But they're unrelenting. I mean, nice image actually. But how would you like a wall of these in your house? Michel painted during dark times, and he was not applauded for the way he painted. On the other hand, I'm not sure I can argue against that. Even what should be a quaint, cheerful scene like this is about as gloomy as it gets. I'm going to open it in preview so we can zoom it. Because this also is a scene that's populated by people, but barely, not in a comforting way. This is about as small and lonely as it gets in art, I believe, creating figures in an environment. Michel may have been crazy. He had some success in the official salons of the time, 1791 to 1814, debuting when he was just 28 years old, but gained little critical acclaim. And then withdrew from publicity for the rest of his life. And I think the issue here is that he expresses himself, but he doesn't explain himself. And if he explained himself, I'm not sure the people of his time would have taken kindly to that. Whew, look at that. Michel may have been crazy because it was crazy times. And yet, I'm not sure that people would have recognized it. In my mind, there's only one thing definitive we could say about Michel, and that is that he could paint. He was incredibly talented and had phenomenal technique. This is an anonymous artist portrait of Michel. Proud, stubborn, maybe a little world-weary, healthy, determined, not going away quickly. And so his work survived. It's just one after another. We can find more by going from images to all. I think this is Wikipedia. Only one image there. Damn. We'll see about 2.5 paragraphs about Georges Michel. We'll see why it's hard to say a lot about him because not a lot was known about him. We see a brief description of the National Gallery of London. That again is about 2.5 paragraphs. And 2 images. And most of the sources we find on him are equally brief. an image that actually has blue skies, though no less gloomy. The gathering storm. Nothing surprising there. ArtNet. Sky done just in black and white. Various sites that we could call surveys, and I don't mean surveys of Georges Michel, surveys of art, trying to catalog what's out there in general, and we do find some Michel paintings within them. I'm just curious about a couple of these. Let's keep going. Okay. This one looked interesting to me. Wow! I haven't denied that he can paint, have I? In fact, I like this image a lot. But what we find are random images by him with very little context given. If I can save this image, I will for myself. There we go. And here we get vigorous work for an artist of that time. Vigorous work for Dutch artists before him. We get visionary skies. Skies that have more life than the earth beneath them. The energy in those clouds, the turbulence. And compared to other images we've seen, have to remark on the greenish tonalities that are part of this piece, the warm tones, the yellows, as opposed to his usual very neutral gray skies, which almost completely separate out from the lower half of the painting. Meaning, a lot of times, Michel's skies are cloudy, but often lacking a sense of light and illumination at all that nonetheless shows up below. So quite a painting here. He was known to work extensively in drawings and watercolors on site, and to be somewhat clumsy at it. Interesting. Past auction. What we know is that some of the only times that information about Michel emerges is through the auctions and exchange of his work. And this might be an example of a sky that seems to detach from the landscape itself. It just doesn't seem any kind of illumination above that could account for the glowing golden landscape below. So on artnet.com, there's probably a better selection here than we get through Google Images itself. So let's come back here in other videos because it seems to be a good source. I'm going to add that to my favorites here. Art. Christie's. Sites that are increasingly obscure and difficult to use. We go to Art Institute of Chicago, another painting called The Storm. And try to save that. And I don't seem to be able to, so I'm going to screenshot it. And as you notice, even with all this, very little biographical information. So let me tell you what I've found. We can describe Michel as a man of his times. So this is where I can't go overboard enough. We could talk about the politics in France during his life, which are so complicated and unfamiliar to me that I cannot explain them. That they're marked by the transition from the French monarchy through the French Revolution, French Empire, the Napoleonic Wars, the establishment of the Estates General, the National Assembly, and the government by terror or the reign of terror, by the exile and execution of most government figures and politicians at some point or other in the transition between regimes, the storming of the Bastille, the establishment of human rights, all achieved through violence. And all coming on the heels of the only peaceful period ruled by Louis XIV, King of France, from 1661 to 1715. where we have the establishment of French culture, but it's of such elevated, artificial type that it's irrelevant to anything that would have been the reality in France at the time. Meaning, if we go to Watteau, we have whimsical fantasy, escapist art, typical of the monarchy, flowery, fairy tale kinds of stuff, strictly refined and courtly. The age of Watteau, Chardin, and Fragonard, the characteristics that I'm talking about ultimately evolving along with what we could call a more provincial style, which was more accurate in portraying daily life and the peasantry, Chardin being the master of that school, which is not him, in contrast with the more stately, official kinds of art, Fragonard. But I was going to do the same thing here, so from Watteau we could go to Fragonard. Most famous images, the swing. And of course here we're referring to the times of Marie Antoinette, who was completely out there in a fantasy make-believe village that she had her servants build for her as kind of a playland where she could pretend she was a peasant and all kinds of things, completely divorced from reality. And then evolving to history painting almost overnight with the downthrow of the monarchy with the French Revolution, where we go back to this neoclassical style, and we have paintings like Louis' portrait of Napoleon, the Oath of the Horatii, which do express the heroism of events during Michel's time, Beth and Marat. But don't allow any room for individual expression. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, Napoleon on his throne, 1806. All Ingres paintings. During Michel's life. So difficult stuff that this guy was up against. My own interest in Michel came from this painting, which is local here in Hartford. View of the plains of Saint Denis from Montmartre in Paris from 1830, which is said to be the culmination of his height of power as a painter, his development of his unique style. And indeed, this is a very realized painting. And its strength to me is that it is transcendent. It does pull us in, and it does explain itself in terms of what the artist is actually thinking, along with his mood. And I think the key in this piece is a sky that's not just stormy, but is celestial, meaning it opens up to the vault beyond. The painting itself offers us an escape to another place that could be said to convey release, purity, redemption, as if the sky is a veil to another world or a better place. And yet along with that, we see in the middle ground what's actually supposed to embody those things, which is a church and the religious solution. And this is a close-up of that church. And it is not an inviting, viable venue, but in fact, dark, opaque, and inaccessible. We see this figure in the foreground progressing towards one of these two alternatives. And we're confronted with the contradiction of a ideological refuge that's ineffective versus a natural refuge that's in fact potentially truly heavenly and authentic. So you can see that this is a powerfully painted piece. I believe I can get to this view, which has been color corrected enough to show the piece a little more clearly. And I have to say, from what I can tell, this is one of the strongest pieces by Michel that I've seen. So I do feel it's revealing. Michel never signed his work. It was his way of showing his artistic integrity. He was married 3 times and had 8 children, all of whom predeceased him, dying before Michel was 57 years old. He was obsessed with painting in plein air from life at a time when no one else was really doing that. He was working with a sensibility that became popular later, particularly in the Barbizon age, before it was practical to paint outside, before paints were packaged in portable tubes, before the invention of the French easel, which would allow a painter to pack up their supplies for easy travel. As I learned recently, before the kinds of brushes that were used by the Impressionists with metallic ferrules that would shape the brush and hog's hair that would create controllable stiff brushes for fast painting. And I'll go so far as to say, before the event of the railroad system in France, which itself facilitated artists traveling outside of Paris into the countryside, into the Barbizon forest, into day destinations for fun and pleasure for the first time in history. I don't think it can be emphasized too much that Michel is a painter of the landscape that was generally accessed by foot. And I believe that if we pursued it further, that we would find that this idea of walking France is a prominent and recognized theme in French art and history. And that along with that goes all the hardships and difficulties of doing just that. Meaning, facing the elements, the cold, the night, the loneliness, the distances, and the dangers that went along with all of that. And I say this because these were the things that everyday people had to deal with. We find descriptions of walking, incredible hard journeys, in stories by all the French writers, particularly in my mind, thinking of scenes from Émile Zola, Maupassant, Balzac, Victor Hugo, and stories about everyday people. If we can use, for example, Van Gogh, traveling by foot across vast distances, virtually to travel across Europe. The exploits of Georges Michel are not the exploits of Napoleon or other historic events, but the exploits of the commoner in France through what is intrinsically a primitive, harsh, and backwards country, albeit a country that's trying to find itself and think of itself in more modern ways. And though I cannot find it written about Michel in this way, it's my opinion that this is where his value lies, his power to inspire, and his appeal that made his art desirable enough to preserve and survive. As obscure and as difficult as it is, as inaccessible and impersonal as it can be, and as poorly understood as it seems to be regarded on the whole. I've been back on artnet.com here, loading these images in while I'm speaking. But I think that the beauty in finding an obscure artist like Michel and looking into him and reflecting on our feelings in terms of how he or she hits us is worthwhile, because we can't expect to always go to a museum or a gallery and see an artist who fits nicely into categories, or was pivotal or an iconic turning point in the history of art, and yet still was crucial and on point in terms of pushing art forward to the next place. Here in the 21st century, when we're looking for the next breakthrough, the next big thing, and ask ourselves more so, are there possibilities that we're overlooking that are still emerging from, wow, look at that, still erupting from mysterious, murky, undefinable places that yet may still hold the key, be the seed from which the next big thing will come. I think that by finding stories like this in art, we may be able to better find ourselves in art if these are the kinds of conditions in which we do exist today. It would be interesting if that were true, and perhaps comforting and helpful to us, as I have to say it is to me. I'm going to save this. Maybe that's why I fell in love with the Georges Michel when I saw it and wanted to know more about this artist. So I hope that's inspiring to you and perhaps motivating and worth considering in terms of looking at artists on your own and perhaps finding new personal favorites that can reveal aspects of art that aren't the usual easy concepts that are taught and to grasp. It's a wonderful thing about art that it can take us on these journeys. I think there's something quintessentially French about appreciating art and all the contributions of artists, great and lesser, who have had something to say over time, and to learn from it on the highest levels. I wish there was more of that. So this has been a really unusual, unintended, unexpected kind of video to make about artists I knew very little about. Oh, look at that. But it's been fun and rewarding and satisfying, and I hope it has been to you also and tapping into some kind of curiosity, which we all need more of. So I guess that's it for today. We'll try to keep things different and exciting here, and we'll see what we come up with next time. And maybe Georges Michel will come back to inform us and haunt our explorations in the future. So we'll thank him for that. Thanks, Georges Michel. Thank you guys, and it's Gary Jacobs, Googling Art, and I hope to see you in the next video. See you again soon.